I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Bronwyn Williams, an economist, trend analyst, futurist, consultant, and author. Bronwyn is the Foresight lead and trend analyst at Flux Trends, the author of The Future Starts Now, published by Bloomsbury Business, and an accomplished strategist and speaker with experience discussing a variety of intersectional business, technology, and social trends. She has a master's in applied economics from the University of Bath, Post-Grad Diploma in Future Studies from Stellenbosch Business School, Foresight and Business Studies at the University of Manchester, in addition to economic and fintech degrees from the London School of Economics and Political Science, University of Oxford, and the University of Johannesburg. So, Bronwyn, welcome. From looking at your work, I got the feeling that the intersectionality of money, technology, and society was kind of the best place to start. So before that, though, I want to get into your recent book, The Future Starts Now. What is the book about? Why should people buy it? And where can they get it?
Yeah, well, you can get it pretty much anywhere that business books are sold. So it's published by Bloomsbury UK. I mean, the easiest place to get it for people living all across the world is probably just good old Amazon. Get it on your Kindle and go. The book was put together by myself and Theo Priestley, another futurist who's based actually in Scotland. So same time zone, but other side of the planet. And what we really saw was that there was an absolute dearth of ideas about the future. There was basically only the singularity view as to where we were headed that we were hearing from politicians, from economists, from other futurists, from everyone that was talking about the future. And there's so few of them to start with. It's a very uncompetitive space when you look beyond the next planning cycle ahead. Seem to have basically one of two views on the future. And we've proven very right in our thesis. Those views have only consolidated since. The one is the climate catastrophe singularity. In other words, we are going to go extinct. And we see the movements like Extinction Rebellion and the anti-natalist movements really pushing this idea forward that climate catastrophe is unavoidable and that we are going to go extinct. And in fact, we should hurry it along and just stop having babies altogether. Very depressing worldview on the one hand. So that'll be the sort of climate catastrophist to the left. But on the right, we have the AI singularity crowd, which is also increasingly excited about accelerating towards some sort of technological singularity that leaves our flawed human vessels behind in favor of some sort of technological, perhaps, immortality through living vicariously through essentially robots of our own creation. Also, not a particularly inspiring vision for the future to get young people excited about even getting out of bed, right? And we do quite a lot of work with my company, Flux Trends in South Africa, looking at Generation Z. I know there's a lot of sort of controversy around generational theory, but Dion, my business partner, and myself, we're quite adamant there's some truth there, and that with Generation Z in particular, they're doing things differently, thinking differently to what other generations did at their same age. And what we really see is this lack of agency, is this lack of belief that they can have any sort of impact in the future. And as such, you become a sort of passive passenger of spaceship Earth rather than a creature of agency and direction that has some sort of influence over not only your own future, but the future of society at large. And that was what the idea we wanted to challenge in the book, Theo and myself. We wanted to challenge those very dark singularity kind of views of the future, both the climate catastrophe view and the AI singularity view, and say, perhaps there's room for some nuance in between these two visions. Perhaps there's an actual glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel that we should hold some space for. That was the first thing, to challenge these views as being inevitable, that they can be contested and influenced. And at the same time, we wanted to try and give people some agency back, to give them the idea that they are actually can be co-creators of the future. And the sort of key lesson that for myself that came out of the process of writing that book, I didn't do much of the writing myself. It was very much a collaborative project working with futurists across the world, because that was the point of the book. The point of the book is stop listening to us. We're not your leaders. We're not defining the future for you. Rather, this is supposed to be something we co-create. So the book was a sort of practical working of that. But the key lesson I learned myself through this project that I was sort of forced into, which just doesn't come naturally to me, was this idea of pragmatic optimism. And this idea that whether you are an optimist or a pessimist, whether you do believe one of those two sort of dark singularity views or not, well, ultimately, at a collective level, the future we buy into is the future that we get, because our beliefs about the future change our actions. And this is something that, of course, makes absolute sense to any economist who knows how important sort of policy positioning is when it comes to determining whether we're going to have recessions or depressions or how deep they're going to be. This whole idea of changing expectations does change reality. People are pessimistic about the future. They don't invest. If you don't invest, then of course your economy shrinks, right? This becomes very sort of practical when you get into it. So that was a lesson that I took out of it. But anyway, the point of the book is not for us to tell you what's coming next. It's rather to say, hey, if you don't like what's going on, maybe you need to start challenging it yourself, and you also need to check your own beliefs and your own assumptions about where we headed, because like it or not, even your very attitude towards the future is important in determining what future we get.
Wow. You've touched on so many key points there. I mean, I think one of the big ones reminds me of the definition of cyberpunk, which seems to pop back into my head. They say that we're living in the cyberpunk century, right? But, one of the ideas there was with classic science fiction, it's like you change one thing and see how the world changes, right? And that is definitely the singularity view. It's like, okay, we're going in this direction and this is our ultimate destination. There's no way to get around that, And one of the authors who defined cyberpunk had said that in that type of fiction, you change everything all at once and just see how things play out. And that seems more like what you're describing, right? It's not one necessary destination. It is a billion choices by billions of people, and those all cumulatively result in the future. I think that's kind of where you're going, right?
Yeah, exactly. Your vote counts. Your vote is where you apply your time, your attention. It's not just available to the richest or most powerful people in the room. Absolutely not. And hey, even if I do want to wear a more pessimistic hat and say perhaps one of those two absolutely catastrophic worldviews of the future is, say it is correct. Say someone can project into the future, which none of us can do. We can't even predict the weather. My app right now is telling me lies about my own weather outside my window, right? Like, we're not getting this prediction thing right at all. But even say worst case scenario, one of those views does end up being inevitable. I think the human condition is this raging against the dying of the light. We are mortals, and we have to sort of hold that thought, that whole memento mori thought in place every day of our lives. We wake up knowing that we're not going to exist forever, and that applies to our species too. But that's not an excuse to do nothing about it. Otherwise, we can all just sort of lie in the same position we were born in, curled up into the fetal position that we arrived in our mother's wombs, and accomplish nothing. That's a non-starter conversation for a personal level. We wouldn't accept that of our own children if they refuse to get out of bed or do anything with their lives because they're going to die one day. The same thing should apply to our species as a whole. We should have some fun while we're here. We should do some stuff. And we should all participate in choosing what that stuff is that we're going to do with our time, however limited it is.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's really exciting about your work also is you have such a focus on entrepreneurship and business, right? And when it comes to futurism, when it comes to foresight and predictions and things like that, it's so sterile and clinical so often, And so you're looking at that and saying, how can we translate this into business so that people can actually create the future and build the economy and make money? So I wanted to ask about that because this is where fortunes are made, but it means paying careful attention to those trends, right?
Exactly. So like fortunes are made, all success is really made by, as I said, it's made by optimists, right? Pessimists don't start businesses, optimists do, right? So like already you've got to kind of start winning there. And optimists also have some sort of a view on the future or how they can bend the future in their own direction. But it's not good enough just to have an idea of what you want. You have to apply some sort of action to do with that. And of course, if you are going to look at making some sort of a difference or making some money, absolutely no judgment to you there. If that's your goal, that's how you want to make an impact in this world, employing some people, paying someone else's bills, growing value for someone, absolutely all good. It's a lot easier to do that if you do understand not just the current trends, but also the deeper human trends and drivers that drive us forward. If you can meet people's needs and give someone else what you want, that's the definition of adding value. And that's where business makes sense. And that's also the big distinction between monopoly industries, which I also spend quite a lot of time ranting about online, and businesses that actually add value. It's the same sort of conversation we have with employees too, because quite often businesses call us in to try and get their teams excited about the future because of all these new trends like minimum effort Mondays and low effort as possible. All those sort of attitudinal things that are creeping into the workplace. You have to get people excited about where you're going to get them to act and be part of your vision. That's the sort of other thing there. But you really do want to make sure that there's something that you can head towards. And one of the things you can do there is, of course, applying to those deep trends that I talk about. So the simplest way to sort of talk about those really deep trends is that I've summarized that in that essentially what we all want, coming back to the point I made earlier about mortality, is that we're all seeking to some degree immortality. And all the theories about consumer behavior, I'm trained in marketing and economics, all these things that kind of understand the big picture there, do come down to that. So we try and achieve that immortality in different ways. We achieve it through sex and reproduction, which is quite a common human way to try and achieve that legacy, the very sort of evolutionary desire to sort of leave your seed and your mark on the planet. We also do that to trying to build legacies, to try and build status among our communities, to build businesses that will last beyond our time, buildings and monuments to our own greatness, at a very sort of practical sort of level there. And others of us try to actually achieve it through trying to live forever. So you kind of see all those movements towards things like life extension. All the billionaires get involved with this. This is because the one thing you can't buy with your money is more time. These are deep drivers that drive us forward. And of course, all the other theories around sort of like mimetic behavior map into that, because we want the acclaim of our peers. We also want our name and our legacy to continue on after us. And if you're able to meet those needs, those are sort of trends that just never go away. Those are sort of trends that were present in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they're still present today. And if you can tap into those from a business perspective, that longer term sort of cause and effect, past, present, future worldview, your business is definitely going to be more successful. But of course, in the short term, there's plenty of trends that you can capitalize on, but understand that they're only going to be there for a moment, whether they are instant pots or air fryers or Bitcoin or Dogecoin, whatever it is. If you're able to spot those sort of short-term arbitrage opportunities, hey, that's exactly why people like to engage our services too, to say, like, you can be ahead of the curve, you can make money while the sun is shining.
Yeah. Well, and I will put all of your info in, and I'm going to put copious book links and all of that into the YouTube show notes. So if people want to reach out and learn more about what you do, they should definitely, reference those notes. Now, I wanted to ask about the post-pandemic economy, the post-pandemic world. The impression that I have is that we're still all kind of holding our breath, waiting to see how the chips fall, so to speak. Do you think that we're in for an economic crash, or do you think that we're in for kind of a soft landing? And I really mean globally, because, the entire world went through this together and it impacted all of these economies. And it's like things are back to normal, but not entirely. Where do you think that this will go?
Yeah, so that's the crazy thing about economics and about money in particular, is that money is an unreal construct. Money is a story at the end of the day, and it has as much value as we think it has value, or as much value as we can force someone else to believe. So the simplest way to think about sort of the value of any money is it's kind of got two components to it. It's got the faith that we have in it, in its ability and its value, which is currently kind of holding the economy together, for better or worse, besides those sort of cracks that you've mentioned in terms of this idea that perhaps something is not all right in the state. And there is that sense, which means that faith is falling. But there's another lever that we have essentially to prop up the value of our currencies, and that's that literal force we have behind it. This again comes back to sort of ancient wisdom, like the strong take what they will, the weak suffer what they must. And like, you're clearly on the United States side of the world, I'm clearly living in a third world country and fast falling out of the middle, sort of the upper middle income towards the lower middle income side of the world. And the thing is that your currency and your country does have the ability to transcend pure faith in the system, given the sort of increase in monetary supply you've seen from there, because you're able to back it up with some sort of credibility and clout, right? The strongest in the room does get to get away with some other stuff. So when we talk about sort of economics being unstable in the sense that we have eaten too much, we've taken from the future, we have eaten somebody else's lunch, there will be bills that are paid, But I think what's frustrating to a lot of people is how late we can delay paying that check, how many generations and how many years we can sort of shuffle around, averting our eyes from the bill, and also where that bill is going to land up, not just through space, but also through time. And people think the system is clearly unfair. We've clearly put so much money into the system. What goes up has got to come down, but it doesn't necessarily have to come down in the same place that it went up, which means that the hard landing people are looking for is probably not going to arrive right now. Rather, it's going to be distributed, much like the sort of flood waters that flood across the world, and are much more diluted in a global sense, which is what we have seen. But also, I think that, going back to the old economic adages of saying that the market can remain irrational a lot longer than you can remain solvent, it's very risky to bet against the strong or to bet against the narratives and the beliefs that people have that they are invested in believing. Much like I mentioned earlier, optimist or pessimist, you are right. There's very good reasons for people to believe in the value of our economies and our currencies because it serves all of our interests. And if we can keep up this collective delusion, we can keep it going really as long as we can get other people to believe in that delusion too, much like religions, right? Like global religions, they don't make sense. Like, why do we all believe in the same stuff? We believe in it because it serves our own interests to believe in things that other people are believing in. So the economy isn't based on logic. The economy is based on us. It's based on irrational people. And that's actually a very good thing going into the future of AI and the workplace and all of those sorts of things, to kind of remember that all value comes from essentially getting other people to believe that it's valuable. And we'll believe in all kinds of things, including sort of like dog-shaped picture coins on Twitter, right? We believe in that stuff.
Yeah.
That's a short answer to say that this is probably the party can go on for longer than it should, and that the wrong people are going to end up paying for it. Essentially, what's going to happen is that poor countries remain poorer, poor people get poorer, and rich countries remain richer and get richer in the long run. This is what we see. So yeah, that's kind of the thesis that I'm looking at the moment. So I will be writing more about this in the future if you want to follow that space.
Yeah, well, let me...
Global economics.
Let me touch on that. So when I was doing story research, I saw that you talk a lot about the growing wealth gap, right? The difference between rich and poor. This is something, even in the United States, right?
Oh, yeah.
It has just been, it's out of control, I guess. And a lot of that is a byproduct of the centralization and the automation, right? Where you have this consolidation of power and this consolidation of wealth, and it's not necessarily intentional. It's not that people are trying to take it away from other people. It's just that as different groups become more successful and that automation, centralizes, I guess, that wealth, it just naturally creates a funnel that concentrates it.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that? And again, how does all of this change in the world affect that? Do you see that continuing to get worse?
Yeah, so there's two ways you can kind of look at this. One is like the reason behind inequality, which if I can pinpoint one thing, like obviously there's many things that are unfair in the world. It's not fair that tall men get paid and laid more and that pretty women get paid and laid more. None of these things are fair, but that's like basic inequality. But if you're talking about monetary inequality. And in fact, this is where capitalism has a leg up on other economic systems, in that money, even though it can be unequal, if the rules are the same, it's less unfair than genetics and nature. Nature is horribly unfair. As I said, like the attractive people definitely win out much more. The strong and attractive in a complete unmonetary society would have massive inequality compared to other people, but money, if the rules are played, yes, there is luck, there is unfairness, there is endowments, but it's easier to redistribute money as a sort of a means of measuring our status in society as opposed to all those other social credit points, which tend to only push towards the absolute best, most popular, high status people in the room. So that's sort of the first thing in terms of money, when it's done well, works very well at reducing inequality, which is something that's quite a controversial thing to say. But that's because our monetary system is not fair. It's not done right, because our money is based on different rules for different people. And if you look at where the root of inequality for me can be summed up with one word, and that is monopoly. In other words, it is force-backed monopoly or legally endorsed monopoly. So whether that's monopoly over currency supply, which is, of course, anyone in the sort of Bitcoin crypto space can give you a long rant in that direction. I'm not going to go into that because it's good reasons to have a central bank in control, separate from your government, in running these systems. We understand that the reason we've got to these problems is has a whole legacy behind it. Some bit well-intended, but not necessarily very practical sort of institutions have built up around it. But the sort of inequalities that we can do things about if we want to are inequalities around artificial scarcity that transfers, basically gets the public to pay for private rights over an asset that could be abundant. So I think some of the greatest culprits in terms of inequality are not only sort of central banks that play fast and loose with economic policy, which is obviously huge, it has huge implications when you get into that, but it's also all the sorts of things around intellectual property or around private rights over water supply in, say, Africa. We're like, why does Nestle own the water supply in Africa? And the thing is, with all these sort of private monopoly rights, they've generally been paid for one-off, even if as the price of that scarce asset or that what should be an abundant assets, as their prices have then become disconnected from essentially the free market price finding mechanism. So in other words, your monopolists, much like the sort of the rent-seeking landlords that Adam Smith spoke about back in the day, essentially become toll takers and writers of their own check. They become extractors rather than providers of value. And if you look under the hood of inequality, wherever it lies, it's almost always it's to do with basically monopoly rights that give private people rights that actually impoverish the public that actually pays to enforce those rights. And controversially, for someone that is probably would find themselves more capitalist libertarian side of the general scoreboard, I think that one of the big issues with inequality is that of property rights too, like the rights of land rights. Because again, these can become generational and create these like increasing differences between wealthy and poor over time. And we try and correct these things with taxes, but taxes are, as long as there's more than one tax code in your country, they become an arbitrage opportunity. So they don't fix these things. But the cause of that inequality then generally comes from monopoly. That's why inequality grows over time. And we can see this all over the place. But what's happening now and what's happened over the last sort of really during the COVID period, if we just want to look at that, but these are trends that have been in place really since the end of the world wars, which was kind of the last sort of financial era that we had and the era that we're living in the aftermath of now, is we've seen the invention of several things that increase velocity, but don't increase value. In other words, they speed up the economic game and they speed up the separation between monopolists or the rent seekers and the rent payers in the world at both a global level and a local level. And the sorts of things that have increased that have been things like technology. Everyone's aware of that sort of elephant charts and how sort of labor productivity is decoupled, of course, from economic growth. Again, if you look under the hood there, you're going to see a whole lot of monopoly rights there too that are underpinning corporate as opposed to individual income growth, but I don't have to go into that. But the leverage we've seen there has generally been in the form of debt, because debt, of course, increases velocity without increasing value. So it increases basically the money in the, as I like to say, the casino part of the economy, the part of the economy where who owns the chips gets distributed at a faster and faster kind of roulette wheel, kind of a spinning pace. But the actual value going on in the economy, which doesn't take place in the casino, is growing at a much slower pace. So we see sort of the movement of wealth from one corner of the world to another increasing, which seems to people that are accumulating that wealth that the economy is growing. But at the same time, your real economy is growing at a very different level, which is why inequality, the speed of inequality is picking up at the moment. And obviously the speed of both which monopolists are engaging in their monopoly rights, if you want to look at like money printing, which of course changes, again, not the value in the world, but rather changes where that value washes up and where it accumulates. And of course, things like debt and AI and technology that increase that velocity again, you can see that these become quite untenable problems. They become problems that are very difficult to unravel because we try and unravel them at a sort of a taxation redistribution level, as opposed to looking under the hood at what's really going on. And because things are moving so fast at that abstracted, financialized layer of the economy, our attention is drawn there, not drawn under the hood to the real causes that are anchoring what is happening in the world right now. And to sort of give you an example there, which is something that I've been on about quite a lot, again, coming back to the COVID example and the massive increase in sort of dollar supply that took place there. Essentially, what happened there was no increase in value, but there was suddenly a lot more money in the world, this potential energy, this imaginary value that was then laundered effectively into the real world. Some people took that extra money and like bought Dogecoin and cryptocurrencies and tokens, and they put it in the casino and they lost and they gambled. So nothing really changed there. Again, just the people who own the casino were the ones that kind of won in that game. But a lot of that imaginary money, that value that we believe in, that potential energy also found its way into purchasing real scarce assets, and not just within the United States, but across the world. This is why global commodity inflation has increased on the one hand, but it's also essentially how real goods and services across the world are now increasingly owned by foreign capital, right? And these are things you're not getting more of. So property, like beachfront property in Africa, for example, or businesses owned in different countries. So real wealth has been exchanged for sort of, nominal wealth. And essentially what happens is if you are strong and you do have a strong currency, you get to buy other people's goods at a discount. And that, of course, increases international inequality, but it also increases domestic inequality because of the whole sort of Cantillon effect and the way things go. People who get to sell their assets first also still get a bit of a bump compared to people who only get to sort of sell in-use consumption goods, whether that's labor or sort of basic goods and services. So this is how sort of increases in the nominal economy, the velocity can increase the speed with which the whole sort of like inequality game is playing. I hope that made sense. So it's quite a long story.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and there are so many topics that you've touched on, and maybe we can come back to these in a future interview if you're open to it. But I mean, yeah, there are so many bits and pieces to this. One of the things that I wanted to ask about, though, that has been in the headlines is AI, and I think ChatGPT just took everyone by surprise, and these systems keep getting better and better and better. And then I have friends who are in the arts who are showing me like basically software art generation programs that are now doing human level art, right? And so one of the concerns there, and this goes back to the equality aspect of it, is yet another sector of the economy going to be put out of work by AI? And then I guess that also goes to this idea of, do you think that something like universal basic income is the ultimate solution to it? I mean, as these systems get better and better and better, right, there will be no one who will be unaffected at some point. So does that mean that we almost have to go to some kind of UBI, or do you think there is another solution?
Well, let's talk about the job thing first. So, of course, AI and any technological advance is going to disrupt certain jobs, more specifically tasks within jobs generally. I think the first sort of caveat to that point is that less and less people are actually employed in a job. More and more people are working in the freelance economy, which is actually a more honest economy. Because what we have seen as the sort of tide goes out, as inequality increases, as corporate power increases compared to labor power and all these sorts of things that seem to be kind of untractable trends, is that we have seen in general that over the course of the last century, we created, as David Graeber said, a whole lot of bullshit jobs. And bullshit jobs are not just low-paid jobs in call centers that are like soul-destroying that you don't want to do. There's also a lot of people that are high earners in places like consulting or graphic design or Excel chart making or PowerPoint chart making, who essentially exist to extract value and rents from their employers and from the economy. And this is a large part of the sort of so-called middle classes, the comfortable middle classes, the middle classes in America and yes, South Africa, who got to buy houses at a discount in the 1950s, generally because, again, their countries or their races, in my country, which is a really ugly thing to say, but it's true, were essentially extracting, again, those sort of monopoly rents from their economies. They were paid too much compared to the value they added to society. But nobody wants to be told that, right? Nobody wants to be told that they're actually being paid more than they really worth. And what AI is doing for us right now is it's doing two things. On the one hand, it's forcing the bullshit job segment of the marketplace, including the very well-paid and the ones who will complain very loudly segment of the market, to be confronted with just how valueless their contribution is, because essentially they were cost eaters in the economy rather than value contributors. There's another group there, like you're talking about the artists and the creatives, who feel like now essentially their ideas have been stolen because AI is entirely backwards looking. AI is trends, it's economic data, it's only in the past. It's pulling from what we've put in and then regurgitating it. There's nothing new there. So it seems very, very unfair to the artistic community, but I have two sort of messages there. The one would be it is all backwards looking, and that as AI is trained on more AI and more people are pressing the button to get the instant work rather than putting any new work into the system, what it is trained on becomes more and more aggressive, kind of like the infinite turtles in the whole sort of joke, or the sort of this infinite regressive spiral towards really homogeneous outputs, which you're already kind of seeing. You could already tell when an image is not because the image doesn't look clear and like it's human, but because there's a sort of sameness that becomes, because our brains are so mimetic, and these AIs are essentially hacking and giving us what we want. And what we want becomes more and more homogenous, just like the Instagram selfie face look, where all the celebrities ended up kind of looking the same, the human beings. Well, our AI output's also going to look more and more the same as time goes by, ironically, which means that if artists and creatives can wait it out for a bit, the only new stuff that's going to be coming into that sort of AI soup, that sort of musical creative sludge pool that we're seeing there, this perfect sludge pool, but it becomes more and more aggressive, is going to come from the outside, which is from humans coming in. Now, that's only good news if you're a really good artist that actually has new ideas to contribute to the conversation, right? But there's a sort of glimmer of hope there that you can look at. But the other thing that's worth talking about is that, like I was saying earlier, our economy is not based on rational numbers. It's not based on pure logic. In fact, the essay I wrote in my book, which was talking about the sort of in defense of imperfect information, was this sort of idea that all value comes from getting other people to believe that you are valuable or to add value to someone's life. And that doesn't change. This is why we have pop stars like Taylor Swift, who's the biggest name in like sort of celebrity dim at the moment, that have outsized value. It's because people like her, then more people like her, and off you go. There's no sort of rational reason. She doesn't make the best music in the world objectively. I'm sure her fans would tell me otherwise. But the idea is that we like what other people like, and that people rise to fame out of pools of sludge, often for very arbitrary reasons. And the world of the creatives, whether you're a musician or an artist or whatever else, has often been driven by those sort of mimetic surges, which means the lucky ones are still going to get lucky. And we're still going to be looking for idols to adore across all those spectra. And those idols are unlikely to be an AI, simply because a person wants it more, will go after it more, will feed into the crowd and give the crowd what they want. We're always looking for heroes. We're looking for artists. We're looking for rock stars, for celebrities. And that need, very human, irrational need, isn't going to go away. And you've got just as much of a chance as popping out of that sort of swamp and taking that crown as any sort of AI has in the past. So I think that's sort of something to look at there. But is it going to be difficult? Absolutely. There are more of us than we want to admit do have bullshit jobs, but this is going to be sort of a great unwashing of the tide and seeing who's wearing pants and who's not. And we've got to be very, very honest with ourselves when we look at the work we do. Are we adding value or not? The good news is freelancers, people that have had to justify their value and go onto outcomes-based contracts, are going to be an advantage to salarymen who thought they were very, very secure going into this future. I think it's going to be very, very tough for people who understood the job market as being a one and done secure place, or even that understand that adding value to society is having a job and not the constant process of adding value to other irrational, crazy human beings' lives. Both good and bad news on that.
Well, no, that's really interesting. So, I mean, if I'm interpreting this right, then really what you're saying is it's kind of a continuation of the same, except that at a faster and faster and faster pace. And so that's maybe the big thing that we have to prepare ourselves for is just, providing the most value possible and just staying up with that pace, which continues to accelerate.
Yeah, and understanding that what people value and are prepared to pay or to trade their own lifetime with is constantly shifting, right? So this idea of constantly reinventing yourself isn't going to go anywhere. The idea of career portfolios, all of those sorts of things, not going anywhere. But it's also a more fun game to play, isn't it? It's a game that could actually in the long run, reduce inequality if we're doing it right. Of course, the inequality can only increase if like those AI generating model-based companies do get intellectual property rights. And you get to the point like in Canada where you're not even allowed to propagate your own succulent plants because the plant is patented. I mean, again, look under the hood of inequality and it's patents all the way down. You know, it's intellectual property laws at the root of all evil. This is my current bugbear.
Okay. Well, Bronwyn, we're just about out of time for today. Let me thank you so much for joining me. It is truly a pleasure and an honor to have you with me. So again, I would love to have you back in the future, but let me close by asking, what do you see coming down the pipe for 2023, for the remainder of this year, and what are your plans for this year?
Yeah, so in terms of what we're going to see more of this year, we're going to the whole sort of Apple launch of the VR thing. We're not done with VR yet, or XR is probably the better word to look at it there. I think that this year is basically it's the beginning of the sort of the escapism era. A lot of the things we've spoken about today, inequality, AI, climate catastrophe, all of this stuff is very, very overwhelming. We are going to see a greater move towards escapism before we come back to reality. Reality is a bit hard to deal with at the moment, especially for younger people at the moment, but I think older people too. So look out for those signals of escapism and lotus eating. We're certainly going to see more of that. As for myself, for the next couple of months, I am busy with another book based on my own country, South Africa. We've got quite an important election cycle coming up next year. And what we're looking at in this book that I'm putting together, also it's, again, a very collaborative project with different thought leaders in both the public and the private sector, is looking at tangible ways that citizens can claw back again their agency towards the near and midterm future of our very flawed, very fragile, but somehow still very resilient country, South Africa, which is a really interesting place to look at. If you do want a preview of the future, I've said this on many platforms, we are very much a preview as to what happens in the weird Western project, that is the general sort of Washington consensus world, when things start to unravel, when you start to run out of people's money, when democracy sort of comes down to its lowest common denominator. And you want to look ahead at social issues, economic issues, even things like universal basic income, which we didn't get into. Not a fan of the concept. It's a nominal solution to a real problem. It kicks cans down the road. It doesn't actually change any of those root problems that I've spoken about. If you really want to get into it, instead of having a universal basic income, you want to look at rather real wealth sharing in communities. Very, very different. So things like Norway's project of having communities or citizens that have a stake in the oil rights of the country. That's a very different proposition to a tax-based universal basic income. You can challenge all those words, just like you can challenge artificial intelligence and all that stuff. But that's quite another in-depth conversation there. Again, focus on the real and the unreal. That's my theme for the year. People are going to be escaping towards the unreal, but the real opportunities are still in the real world. However tempting it is to sort of bend in the other direction. Always try to separate those two thoughts. What's real? What's a distraction?
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today.